I never thought my own children would say those words to me. Stop calling us. We have our own lives. I sat there in silence, completely broken. But that night, I made one phone call they never expected, and a few weeks later, when they tried walking back into my house like nothing happened, security was waiting at the door. What happened after that changed our family forever. Welcome to Dad's True Revenge. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from today. And if stories about family betrayal and emotional justice touch your heart, subscribe softly now, because this story only gets more shocking from here. I never thought my own children would say those words to me. My son looked me straight in the eyes and said, "Stop calling us. We have our own lives." My daughter didn't even defend me. She just stood there, cold and silent. I still remember the sound of the clock in my kitchen that night. Tick, tick, tick. Nobody spoke after that. I stood there completely broken, after everything I had done for them, after every birthday, every hospital visit, every sacrifice. But what hurt me most was what happened next, because later that same night, I made one quiet phone call, and from that moment on, my children had no idea their lives were about to change forever. I barely slept that night. I sat alone in my recliner with the television running low, but I wasn't watching anything. My wife had passed away 6 years earlier, and for the first time since losing her, the house felt truly empty. I kept replaying my son's words in my head. We have our own lives, as if I had become some burden they needed to escape from. Around midnight, I walked into the hallway and looked at the old family photos. Christmas mornings, fishing trips, graduation day. I remember whispering, "When did I become unwanted?" But then something strange happened. My phone buzzed. For 1 second, I thought maybe one of them felt guilty. Maybe they wanted to apologize. My hands were shaking when I picked it up. But the message wasn't from my children. It was from someone I had not spoken to in almost 20 years. And what they said made my stomach turn cold. The text message came from an old friend named Walter. He used to work with me back when I owned my construction company. His message was short. "Frank, I think your kids are hiding something from you." I stared at the screen for almost a full minute. My heart started pounding. At first I thought maybe Walter was confused, but then he called me directly. His voice sounded nervous. He told me he had overheard my son talking at a restaurant 2 weeks earlier, laughing, bragging, saying the house would belong to them soon anyway. I felt sick hearing those words. Walter hesitated before saying one more thing. "Frank, they were talking about putting you in assisted living." I couldn't breathe for a second. Assisted living? Without even speaking to me first? I still remember looking around my own living room that night, suddenly feeling like a stranger inside my own house. But the worst discovery came the very next morning. The next morning, I decided not to call my children. For the first time in years, I stayed silent. Instead, I drove across town to meet someone else. My lawyer. The same man who helped my wife and me years ago when we bought our first property. He looked surprised when I walked into his office alone. I told him everything. The cold words, the silence, Walter's warning. I expected him to comfort me. Instead, he asked me one question that froze my blood. "Frank, have your children asked you to sign anything recently?" Suddenly I remembered the papers my daughter casually pushed toward me last month. She said they were insurance documents. I never read them carefully. My chest tightened. My lawyer quickly pulled copies from public records online. Then he slowly removed his glasses and looked straight at me. "Frank, your children may have already started planning this months ago." And at that moment, I realized this betrayal went far deeper than hurt feelings. I felt physically sick sitting in that office. My own children, planning behind my back. My lawyer showed me paperwork connected to power of attorney discussions. Nothing was finalized yet, but my children had clearly been asking questions, quietly, carefully, like they were preparing for something. I kept thinking about my late wife. She always warned me not to ignore certain signs. "Love your children," she used to say, "but never become blind." I wish I had listened sooner. My lawyer leaned forward and lowered his voice. "Frank, if you want control over your life, you need to act now." That sentence changed everything, because for the first time, I stopped feeling weak. The pain was still there, but underneath it, something else started growing. Something colder, something stronger. I walked out of that office differently than I walked in, and before sunset that same day, I made a decision that would leave my children completely stunned. Before sunset, I returned home and locked the front door behind me. Then I did something I had never done before. I turned off my phone completely. No calls, no messages, No waiting for my children to suddenly care. The silence felt heavy at first, but strangely peaceful too. The next morning, my lawyer arrived with several folders and a serious expression. We spent hours reviewing everything: my properties, savings, business investments I had quietly kept for years. My children thought I was just an old retired man living off a pension. They had no idea how much my wife and I had built together. Around lunchtime, my lawyer looked at me carefully and asked, "Are you certain you want to change everything?" I stared out the kitchen window for a long time before answering, because deep down, I knew this was the point of no return. And once I signed those papers, nothing in our family would ever be the same again. My hand trembled slightly as I signed the first document. I never imagined I would one day protect myself from my own children. Every signature felt painful, but also necessary. My lawyer explained everything slowly: new estate instructions, property control, emergency protections, even private security recommendations if family conflict escalated. Hearing those words out loud broke something inside me: family conflict. That phrase sounded unreal, yet here I was. By the afternoon, my lawyer suddenly paused and asked, "Frank, when was the last time your children visited you without asking for something?" The room went silent. I tried thinking of one honest answer, one simple visit, one genuine conversation, but I couldn't, not one. That realization hurt more than their cruel words. Then my lawyer handed me one final document. "This," he said quietly, "is the one they'll never expect." And the moment I read it, even I was shocked. The final document wasn't about money, it was about the house. The home my wife and I spent 43 years building together. My lawyer suggested placing strict legal protections around the property immediately. Nobody could enter without my direct approval. Nobody could pressure me into leaving. Nobody could suddenly manage my affairs behind closed doors. At first I hesitated. This was still my family, my children. But then I remembered my daughter sliding those papers toward me with that fake smile. "Just sign here, Dad." Suddenly my hesitation disappeared. I signed every page. My lawyer nodded slowly and said, "You'd be surprised how often this happens." That sentence stayed with me all night. How many fathers sat alone like this? How many parents realized too late their kindness had become weakness in someone else's eyes? But while I was asking myself those questions, my children were already planning their next move. 3 days passed without hearing from my son or daughter. Not one call, not one message asking if I was okay. At first the silence hurt deeply, then it started telling me the truth. I was only important when they needed something. On the 4th evening, my phone finally lit up, my son. I stared at the screen while it rang. Part of me still hoped he missed me, that maybe guilt had finally reached him. I answered quietly, but his first words crushed that hope immediately. "Dad, why haven't you answered your phone? We've been trying to reach you." Not "how are you?" Not "are you okay?" Just irritation, control. I told him calmly I needed some space. Then there was a pause I will never forget. His voice changed instantly, colder, sharper. "Dad, you're not making strange decisions, are you?" And suddenly, I realized he was afraid of something. That question haunted me all night. "You're not making strange decisions, are you?" Strange decisions. As if protecting myself was somehow betrayal. I barely slept. Around 6 in the morning, someone knocked hard on my front door. My heart jumped. I looked through the window and saw my daughter standing there with forced concern on her face. Beside her stood a man I had never seen before, carrying a leather briefcase. I opened the door only halfway. My daughter smiled nervously and said, "Dad, we just want to help you organize a few things." Then the stranger stepped forward and introduced himself as a financial advisor. Something felt terribly wrong. My daughter kept avoiding eye contact. The man kept glancing around my house. Then he casually asked if we could sit privately to discuss future care arrangements. In that exact moment, every warning from my lawyer suddenly became terrifyingly real. I invited them inside, but I didn't trust either of them anymore. My daughter sat stiffly on the couch while the so-called financial advisor opened his briefcase like he had rehearsed this moment many times before. He spoke softly, too softly, explaining retirement transitions, long-term care, reducing stress, but every sentence sounded like they were slowly erasing my life right in front of me. Then he placed several documents on the table and slid them toward me. I recognized that trick immediately. My daughter finally looked at me and whispered, "Dad, this is for your own good." Those words hit me harder than shouting ever could. My own child speaking to me like I was already incapable of making decisions. I pretended to read the papers calmly. But inside, something else was happening. Because hidden inside my jacket pocket was something neither of them knew about. And if I used it, everything would change instantly. Inside my jacket pocket was a small recorder my lawyer had given me 2 days earlier. If they pressure you, he said, document everything. At first, I felt ridiculous carrying it around. But now, I understood why. I quietly pressed the button while the advisor kept talking. My daughter started mentioning assisted living communities nearby, smiling, acting gentle, but her eyes felt distant, empty almost. Then the advisor said something that made my stomach tighten. These transitions usually go smoother when property ownership is handled early. Property ownership. There it was, finally spoken out loud. I looked directly at my daughter and asked one simple question. Were you planning to move me out of my own house? Her face changed instantly. Panic flashed across her eyes for just 1 second before she forced another smile. But she never answered the question. And that silence told me more than words ever could. The room became painfully quiet after my question. Even the advisor stopped talking. My daughter crossed her arms tightly and finally said, Dad, you're overreacting. Overreacting. I almost laughed hearing that word. After everything I had sacrificed for them. After decades of working double shifts so my children could have opportunities I never had. Suddenly, my son walked through the front door without knocking. He looked irritated the second he saw me sitting calmly instead of signing papers. What's taking so long? He snapped at his sister. I will never forget that moment, not because of anger, but because for the first time, I saw my children clearly. Not as the little kids I raised, but as adults making calculations about my life. My son sat down aggressively and said, Dad, this house is too much for you now, but he had no idea what I had already done behind the scenes. I stayed calm while my son kept talking. He spoke about safety, maintenance, responsibility, but every sentence sounded rehearsed, like they had discussed this many times before arriving. Then he finally leaned forward and asked the question they both truly came for. Dad, have you updated anything legally? There it was, the real fear hiding underneath their concern. I answered slowly. Why would that matter? My son glanced nervously toward the advisor before forcing a smile. We just want to make sure everything stays organized. Organized. Such a clean word for something so ugly. I could feel tension filling the entire room now. My daughter looked pale. The advisor suddenly seemed uncomfortable too, almost like he realized this family situation was becoming dangerous territory. Then my phone buzzed loudly on the table. One message from my lawyer. I looked down at the screen, and my blood instantly ran cold. The message from my lawyer said only 6 words. Do not sign anything under pressure. That was it. But reading those words while sitting across from my own children felt surreal. I slowly placed the phone face down and looked at both of them carefully. My son noticed my expression immediately. Who keeps texting you? He asked sharply. I didn't answer. Instead, I pushed the documents back across the table untouched. The advisor cleared his throat nervously. My daughter suddenly changed her tone completely. Softer now. Almost emotional. Dad, why are you treating us like strangers? That question nearly broke me, because the truth was, they had started treating me like one long before I realized it. Then my son stood up abruptly and said something I will never forget for the rest of my life. Something so cold. Even the advisor looked shocked hearing it. My son looked straight at me and said, Dad, Mom would have wanted us to handle this by now. The second those words left his mouth, something inside me shattered. Don't use your mother against me. I wanted to scream it, but I stayed quiet. My wife loved this house. She planted every rosebush outside with her own hands. She cried tears of joy the day we paid off the mortgage together, and now our children were using her memory like leverage. Even the advisor lowered his eyes awkwardly. My daughter started crying softly beside him, but something about it felt forced, practiced almost. Then my son said another sentence that froze the entire room. You can't live alone forever. Not concern, not love, control. That's when I realized this was no longer about helping me. It was about removing me. And they still had no idea the house legally no longer belonged where they thought it did. I stood up slowly and walked toward the hallway where my wife's photograph still hung on the wall. For a moment, nobody spoke. I just stared at her smile in that picture and remembered the promise I made beside her hospital bed years earlier. I'll protect what we built. Back then, I thought I was protecting it for our children. Now, I understood something painful, Sometimes parents must protect themselves from the very people they raised. I turned back toward the living room and calmly told everyone the meeting was over. My son immediately became angry. "Dad, you're being manipulated," he snapped. "Manipulated?" The irony almost made me laugh. My daughter suddenly asked if I had changed the will. I noticed fear in her voice now, real fear. Before I could answer, someone knocked firmly on the front door. 3 sharp knocks. And the second I opened it, my children's faces changed completely. Standing at the front door was my lawyer. Beside him were 2 professionally dressed security officers. The room behind me went completely silent. My son stepped forward instantly. "What is this?" he demanded angrily. My lawyer remained calm, very calm. He handed me a folder first, then looked directly at my children. "Mr. Frank requested additional legal protections regarding this property." My daughter's face lost all color. My son started talking loudly, accusing me of being confused, pressured, emotional, but nobody interrupted him. The more he spoke, the worse he looked. Then one of the security officers quietly explained that from this point forward, entry to the property would require my direct permission. I still remember the expression on my son's face, shock, then anger, then panic, because suddenly he realized something terrifying. He no longer had control over the situation, and that's when everything truly exploded. My son slammed his hand against the kitchen counter so hard the coffee cups rattled. "This is insane," he shouted. My daughter started crying openly now, begging me not to tear the family apart. But those words came too late. The family had already been breaking for a long time. I had simply refused to see it. My lawyer calmly opened the folder and began explaining updated legal directives. The house, financial access, property protections, everything had changed, completely legally. Completely finalized. My children looked stunned. My son kept shaking his head like he couldn't believe it. Then suddenly he pointed toward the hallway and yelled, "After everything we've done for you?" That sentence hit me hard, because deep down, I wanted to ask him the same thing, after everything I had done for them. Then my daughter whispered something so quietly, almost nobody heard it, but I did, and it changed everything again. My daughter lowered her head and whispered, "We already promised someone the house." For a second, I honestly thought I misheard her. The room went dead silent. Even my son looked horrified she had said it out loud. My lawyer slowly removed his glasses and stared at both of them carefully. "Promised it to who?" he asked. My daughter immediately covered her mouth, realizing what she had revealed, but the damage was already done. My son tried interrupting, tried redirecting the conversation, but panic had completely taken over now. Then my daughter finally broke down crying and admitted they had been discussing selling the property months earlier, before even talking to me, before asking what I wanted. They had already started planning their future around my disappearance from this house. I felt physically numb hearing it. But what shocked me most was discovering they weren't acting alone. My lawyer asked them one more time who else was involved. My son refused to answer. But my daughter was emotionally collapsing now. Between tears, she admitted a real estate developer had been speaking with them for nearly 4 months. Apparently, the land under my home had become extremely valuable after new commercial plans nearby. That's when everything suddenly made sense. The sudden pressure, the fake concern, the rushed paperwork. They weren't trying to protect me. They were trying to secure a deal before I discovered the truth. I sat down slowly because my legs felt weak. My wife and I built that home from nothing. We painted those walls ourselves, and now strangers were discussing profits from it while I was still alive inside it. My son finally shouted that they were thinking about the future. But hearing that sentence only made the betrayal feel colder, because their future no longer seemed to include me at all. The security officers quietly stepped closer as my son's anger kept rising. He accused my lawyer of poisoning my mind. He accused me of humiliating the family. But nobody could erase what had already been revealed. Then something unexpected happened. My daughter suddenly looked at me and whispered, "Dad, this wasn't supposed to happen like this." For the first time all day, I saw genuine regret in her eyes. Small, fragile, but real. My son immediately turned on her. "Stop talking," he snapped harshly. That moment told me everything. She had followed his lead for a long time, maybe out of pressure, maybe out of weakness. But my son had become something else entirely, someone I barely recognized anymore. Then my lawyer handed me another document quietly, one final protection measure. He said I could sign it now, or wait. But once I heard what it was, the entire room froze again. The document would permanently remove both of my children from any future claim over the property. Completely, legally, final. My son exploded the second he heard that. "You can't do this to your own family," he shouted. I looked at him for a long moment before answering softly, "Family." That one word seemed to hit harder than yelling ever could. My daughter started sobbing quietly on the couch. I could see years of guilt suddenly crashing down on her all at once. But my son still refused to back down. He kept talking about fairness, inheritance, rights. Imagine hearing your own child speak about your life like a business transaction. Then I noticed something strange. My lawyer was watching my daughter very carefully, almost like he suspected she still hadn't revealed everything yet. And a few seconds later, she finally told us the real reason they became so desperate. My daughter admitted they were drowning in debt, credit cards, failed investments, loans my son secretly took trying to expand his business too quickly. The developer had offered them an enormous amount of money for the property, enough to erase everything overnight. That's when they started seeing my house as an answer instead of a home. I closed my eyes hearing that confession. Part of me felt angry. Another part felt deeply sad because they could have simply come to me honestly. I would have helped them. I always had. But greed and desperation had slowly turned them into strangers. My son finally stopped arguing. He just stood there breathing heavily, unable to even look at me anymore. Then my daughter whispered something that completely broke my heart. "Dad, we didn't think you'd find out this soon. Not we were sorry, not we were wrong." And in that moment, I knew exactly what I had to do next. I signed the final document slowly while my children watched in complete silence. My hand felt steady this time, not angry, not emotional, just clear. My lawyer closed the folder carefully, and the security officers stepped back toward the door. Everything was officially over. My son looked destroyed. My daughter could barely stop crying. Before they left, I said something I had carried in my heart for months. "I loved you more than I loved myself. That was my mistake." Nobody answered. My daughter tried walking toward me, but I gently stepped back. Some wounds don't heal the moment tears appear. Then the security officers escorted them outside. I watched through the window as they stood at the gate, staring back at the house they thought would soon belong to them. But the house stayed exactly where it belonged, with me, and for the first time in many years, I finally felt peace inside my own home again. The house felt painfully quiet after they left. I stood alone in the kitchen listening to the same clock that once filled our family dinners with warmth. Tick, tick, tick. The silence no longer felt angry, just heavy. I walked slowly through each room that night, remembering birthdays, Christmas mornings, my wife laughing near the stove. Revenge sounded satisfying in people's minds, but nobody talks about what comes after, the emptiness, the grief. Because even after betrayal, they were still my children. Around midnight, I noticed my daughter's coffee cup still sitting on the table untouched. I stared at the lipstick mark on the rim for a long time before finally throwing it away. My hands shook doing it. Then just before bed, my phone buzzed softly. One message from my daughter, only 4 words, "Dad, please talk to me." And somehow, those words hurt more than everything else combined. I didn't answer her message that night, or the next morning. But 2 days later, someone knocked quietly at my front gate. Not the front door, the gate. I looked outside and saw my daughter standing there alone in the rain. No expensive clothes, no fake confidence, no rehearsed smile, just tears, real tears this time. I walked outside slowly while security watched from a distance. My daughter could barely speak at first. Then she finally admitted something I never expected. The developer had manipulated them from the beginning, promising fast money, convincing my son the property was wasted on an old man living alone. She confessed she felt trapped once things went too far. But the sentence that broke me came next. "Dad, Mom would hate who we became." I looked away immediately because tears filled my eyes hearing that. Then my daughter handed me something small from her pocket. My late wife's wedding ring. My wife's wedding ring had been missing for almost a year. My daughter admitted my son secretly took it during one of their visits, hoping to sell it when his debts became overwhelming. Hearing that nearly crushed me. But my daughter said she found it hidden away weeks earlier and couldn't live with the guilt anymore. I held that ring tightly in my hand while standing in the rain beside my broken child. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then I finally said the truth that had lived inside me through all this pain. Money didn't destroy this family, silence did. My daughter collapsed into tears, and for the first time in many years, I hugged her again. Not because everything was fixed, it wasn't. Some scars remain forever, but because life becomes very lonely when pride replaces forgiveness. Months later, the house remained mine, quiet. peaceful, protected. But now, every Sunday evening, one chair at my dinner table was no longer empty anymore.